because a lot of people didn't necessarily know some of the original history and the challenges that the synagogue had in being built here in River Forest, and also the rejection it had in trying to be built in Oak Park. So I wanted to tell that story, and I thought, what better opportunity than actually at the 75th anniversary? So I spent a lot of time researching that. This talk is about 25 minutes. I think it would be good I give it. I'll take all the questions you have. Then I spent the last month and a half at Oak Park Temple in their basements and talking and reviewing. And I know Amor Siskin already spent a lot of time, rest in peace, a lot of time writing, I think, the website history there. But I found papers and documents that I think it elucidates some of the other material that I had about Oak Park in the 1950s and some of the experiences of anti-Semitism that the village had, but also that Oak Park Temple had in being built. So I have a separate presentation I can give on that. That's about 20 minutes, and then I will take questions from that. So without further ado, I'll start with this one. I entitled this talk, How Goodly is Thy Dwelling Place? 75 Years of West Suburban Temple, Har Zion. Took the title from the inscription at the top of the shoal in the main sanctuary, Matovu Ohalecha Yaakov Mishnotecha Israel. Our story begins in Oak Park in the 1930s. Oak Park was then known, and still is sometimes known, as the Village of Churches, but had not had a permanent Jewish congregation until that point. An earlier congregation, composed of about 50 families, had formed in 1916, but was never able to secure a permanent building or a dedicated rabbi. By 1927, what survived of the Hosea Community Center, as it was known, was its sisterhood, which called itself the West Suburban Jewish Women's Club. It's operated a once-a-week Sunday school at 1040 West Madison Street as a rented hall there, a rented shop. Two Jewish youth groups also met at this location, one for the teenagers in the local high school, and another for the college-age youth under 21. By this time, in the early mid-1920s and early 1930s, more Jewish families were moving into Oak Park. The Jewish community that flocked here was middle class, drawn from small businessmen, including furriers, dry cleaners, and jewelers, as well as a professional class of dentists, doctors, and lawyers. Many moved from Chicago's more heavily concentrated Jewish neighborhoods on its west side. By 1933, it was estimated that there were 900 Jewish people living in Oak Park at a time when the village's total population was about 60,000. Charles, what button do I press to advance?
It should be.
The arrow?
No, yeah, it should be. It's not, here, I'll just
let you advance it, and I'll point to you every time. There you go. There's Oak Park in the 1930s. You can advance it one more, Charles. In May of 1933, these three groups, the West Suburban Jewish Women's Club, the group calling itself Jewish Juniors, and the Jewish Young People of Oak Park, came together to organize for a Jewish community house, a location for these groups and other Jews to meet for religious and social gatherings. They invited everyone interested in having Jewish contact to attend the meeting. And so this is the letter that was sent out to all Jews and posted. If it was bigger, you could read all the content, but I quoted liberally from it. Among the attendees was Joseph Schachner. Joseph Schachner had moved into the village a few years earlier and had become a prominent attorney in town. He headed a local businessman's district on Marion Street. He was featured, as you see here, in a pictorial spread in the Oak Leaves as an important local leader. Finding no organized shul in Oak Park at the time, Schachner had, by the late 1920s, organized a minyan with other local Jewish businessmen, which he hosted in the lower floor of his law office. Out of that meeting, which took place in May of 1933 with all the groups, which was held at the Carlton Hotel, came a plan to establish the West Suburban Jewish Community Center. The group also elected Mr. Schachner as its first president. In March of 1935, the West Suburban Jewish Community Center, which started calling itself the Center, applied for a charter from the state of Illinois signed by 56 members of the community. In 1936, the center hired a permanent Hebrew school teacher, Roy Brenner, and in August of that year, it purchased its first permanent home in a shuttered dance studio at 414 West Lake Street. And so this is the building as it appeared around that time. And as you see, this is how Oak Park's other newspaper, the Oak Parker, announced the purchase of the property by the center. Jewish people buy Lake Street site for a community center. Covered front page news. In May of 1938, after a months-long search, the center hired its first rabbi, Israel Weisfeld. 32 years old, born in Poland, Weisfeld previously served as rabbi for the Agudat Achim congregation on the north side. While Rabbi Weisfeld trained as an Orthodox rabbi at Yeshiva University, he had also received a BA from the University of Miami and was working toward a PhD in divinity studies at the University of Chicago while he was here. The congregation at the center was not strictly observant, and many members previously belonged to Reform congregations, while others, like Schachner, had come from more Orthodox and conservative traditions. There may have been actually some confusion as to which religious movement the center affiliated with. The Sentinel, the Jewish newspaper at the time, described it as, quote, modern conservative. Under Weisfeld's direction, the center opened a 4-day-a-week Hebrew school. Weisfeld led Bible study classes, lectured on current events, and instituted regular congregational Friday night services for the first time. And here you see him with, I believe, the first confirmation class at the center from June of 1940. An ardent Zionist, Weisfeld soon became the head of the Austin and West Suburban Zionist District and a leader of the Chicago Rabbinical Council. He was also outspoken against fascism and the threat posed by Hitler. Lectures that he gave in 1939 and 1940 entitled America's Fascist #1, Charlie Coughlin, The New European Diplomacy and Jews, and Crisis in Palestine demonstrate his political engagement. Socially, the center hosted nightly youth groups. At Hadassah meetings, the Temple Sisterhood, and a men's club. So here you have the men's club, and I think if you look in the back, you can see a bowling trophy sitting on top of an organ. Gives you a sense of the social milieu of the time. By 1939, the membership had doubled from 75 to 150 families. It was a bustling center of Jewish communal life, serving a growing middle-class community. From the moment they purchased the property at 414 West Lake Street, the center's leadership knew the small dance studio with 1 hall and 3 administrative offices, and I think you just saw the hall in the previous picture, that's what it looked like, could not accommodate the congregation's needs, and the space was not well suited for a house of worship. The center held a fundraiser, here's some pictures from it, in 1939 for a building fund, and they hired an architect to design plans for a larger shul. Amidst this activity, Oak Park's Gentile elites became aware the center planned to expand or otherwise acquire a suitable building to serve as its synagogue. In that late 1939, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC, a federal agency that refinanced distressed mortgages, conducted its periodic review of real estate in Oak Park. HOLC's real estate maps divided the village into distinct areas coded by color, the infamous redlining maps. These identified the quality of the investment by judgment of a number of factors, which included the ethnic and racial makeup of these areas. Reviewing the northeast area of Oak Park, which as you see here is C-138, which included the West Suburban Jewish Community Center building, the report warned, "It is a changing area due to Jewish infiltration, and many owners are more anxious to sell now than they were in 1937. A small synagogue is located in the southwest corner of the area, and it is not unlikely that a larger structure will eventually be built. In view of the Hebrew custom of walking to religious service, this proximity has and will result in further infiltration. Racial transition and rather slow demand have been considered." This report, this excerpt of it here, it was written by Homer Bundy, president of the George Hemingway Real Estate Organization. And just so for context, George Hemingway is Ernest Hemingway's uncle. He owned a very large real estate concern. He retired in early 1939 and Mr. Bundy took over. This area was graded, this was published in the beginning of February of 1940, and the area was graded a C-, marked in yellow, you can see from the coloring. That's the lowest rating above the dreaded red. Red had been reserved only for areas considered blighted and historically had been used in African-American neighborhoods. The same report also noted, Oak Park Village affairs are well administered by a local government comprised of real estate men. And so we assume, and I think it's a fair assumption given the author of this, that those real estate men would have known about this report since it was authored by one of their own. These real estate men administering Oak Park's village board were no doubt concerned about the dim prospects for Northeast Oak Park when, on February 5th, 1940, they unanimously voted on a frontage consent ordinance that had never been presented or debated before. The new ordinance mandated that any construction of any, quote, church or place for religious purposes required a consent of 51% of all property owners within a 400-foot radius of the proposed site. Consent that could be withdrawn until a building permit was issued. This is often known as is referred to in the historical record as a neighbor's veto. They did not, the real estate men, the village board, did not, of course, notify the West Suburban Jewish Community Center of this new ordinance that would have directly impacted them. The blurb on the left is how the oak leaves covered the ordinance, which provides you a sense that the amendments are designed to protect vested interest in residential neighborhoods against conditions that would have an adverse effect on such homes. The center's leadership was wholly unaware that behind the scenes, the village had moved to snuff out its building plans. In the summer of 1940, the center submitted its architectural plans for a new synagogue at 414 Lake Street to the village. At this meeting, the center's representative, Sam Schmetterer, who was a real estate attorney, learned of this frontage consent ordinance for the first time. He was outraged. The synagogue board meeting that followed erupted into a raucous debate. Should the center sue the village of Oak Park over this ordinance targeted at the only Jewish house of worship in the community? Schmetterer recalled that the center's own attorneys, quote, advised us that the ordinance could not legally affect our rights and that we could, by court proceedings, compel the village to grant us a building permit. We were rather hesitant and reluctant to force the issue through our courts. Instead, the members tried to obtain the consents from their neighbors, but they were unsuccessful in reaching the needed 51%. Schmetterer bitterly recalled, quote, this was during the Adolf Hitler period of world unrest, and its effect on our country was at that time rather disheartening. There was always talk of hush hush and leave well enough alone. Don't do anything to antagonize our neighbors. Indeed, as the war in Europe loomed, the Jewish community found itself at odds with the prevailing isolationist sentiment in Oak Park. On January 2nd, 1941, the local newspaper quickly organized a well-advertised town meeting at OPRF High School. I'm sorry, it was actually OP High School. RF has not been part of the deal. With speakers from the Isolationist America First Committee and the Committee on the other side for the Defense of Democracies, which advocated arming Britain. The lively audience of 1,000 people was unable to, quote, restrain themselves from derisive laughter, involuntary answers to questions, or loud applause at what pleased them. By month's end, January 1941, Oak Park had its own branch of the America First Committee with an office on downtown Lake Street, where the Courageous Bakery is today. By July of 1941, 6 months later, the chapter claimed 6,000 members at a time when the population of Oak Park numbered about 65,000. The Chicago Tribune profiled the branch. The branch sent a large delegation to the National America First Committee in Washington, D.C., and the local newspaper covered the activities of this branch weekly with front page stories, ads, summaries of the arguments raised by its speakers. The paper's editorial columnist slammed Jews, who were quoted as coded as quick-triggered foreigners who are foreign in their own countries, as well as not being able to get along with other folks. America First attitudes also prevailed at the high school, according to Jewish resident Zita Holden, who recalled that her Gentile classmates vilified President Roosevelt, who they referred to derisively as Rosenfeld. In sharp contrast, the 20 to 25 Jewish students in the high school, that's about how many she remembers, supported FDR's arsenal of democracy. According to her, the classmates also informally excluded Jews from certain extracurricular clubs. As a result, for Holden and her Jewish classmates, the West Suburban Jewish Community Center was the saving grace, she said. That was our social life. That was our everything life. By contrast, Rabbi Weisfeld was a dedicated opponent of fascism and organized efforts to help Britain, France, and Poland during the Nazi war of aggression. In what is probably the first debate against isolationism in our area, Rabbi Weisfeld took the position favoring aid to the Allies at River Forest's Methodist Church. Weisfeld represented the minority view in that debate, but the words he used to close his address are preserved in the newspaper record. are prophetic ones that would be echoed by Dr. Martin Luther King a generation later. So you see here, Dr. Weisfeld concluded by saying, the arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. These are the words originally of an abolitionist Methodist preacher from the 1850s, inveighing against slavery. But Rabbi Weisfeld, through my research, seems to have been one of the few, until Martin Luther King, to reclaim these words for what was in effect a moral crusade. Rabbi Weisfeld was consistent, an opponent of America First, which he saw as an extension of the same anti-Semitic forces taking over the continent in Europe. For this brave position, Rabbi Weisfeld received threatening phone calls in the night. His daughter recalled to me when I spoke to her this past summer. Given these attitudes, Oak Park's Jewish community continued to experience overt anti-Semitism in its efforts to build a synagogue. On January 11th, 1941, Oak Park's Board of Village Trustees received a letter from Gilbert Volk, secretary of the Northwest Community Club of Oak Park, which was a civic organization dedicated to improving and, quote, maintaining said section as a highly restricted residence section. Mr. Volk wrote, rumors have been brought to our attention of the members of the Northwest Community Club of Oak Park that a Jewish synagogue is to be established at Augusta and Belfort Avenue. At the last regular meeting on January 9th, 1941, the secretary was instructed to express the disapproval of the club as to any permit regarding the establishing of a Jewish synagogue at the above-mentioned location or any other location in Northwest Oak Park. So the location, just so we know, that's the building was the original location of Grace Lutheran Church. It currently is a church. You probably drove by it on the way here. That church had been vacant for 10 years in 1941. So we're talking about a vacant building. Mr. Volk was actually a justice of the peace of Oak Park. A year prior, he was a respected resident. He was a deacon of the local First Evangelical Church. Earlier in the late 1930s, he had given lectures at that church with such titles as How Propagandists Put It Over on Us. So it's not a subtle message. And I think you can see here in the bottom right, the newspaper again whitewashed the anti-Semitic tone of this letter, which was published in the village board minutes. So we're not talking about something that is not possible to find. I found it by looking at the archives at the Oak Park Public Library. With the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, the Oak Park branch of the America First Committee closed, as did all chapters nationwide by the end of that week. The center had to abandon its plans for a new synagogue until the close of the war, as building materials and construction were limited to war needs. Oak Park was quick to mobilize for war, and so was its Jewish community. 57 young men from the center enlisted, and it's hard to read, but these are their names, and this is how it was published in the bulletin. The center itself became a local Red Cross blood donation unit, set local records for a number of repeat donations throughout the war. Weisfeld, we know, presided over the burial of at least one fallen soldier from the Kihila. On D-Day in 1944, as news came in over the wires that the invasion of Europe had begun, the entire congregation was called and appeared for an early morning prayer service for victory and the safe return of their sons. The war's end, the congregation once again turned its sights to building a shoal. Returning GIs brought new Jewish families to the western suburbs at the end of World War II. A 1946 religious census counted approximately 1,000 Jews in Oak Park and about 125 in River Forest, which counted as a bit more than 1% of the population in both villages. Beginning in 1946, the center therefore decided to build a new synagogue in River Forest. Compared to Oak Park, River Forest was sparse, numbering 9,500 people in 1940 compared to Oak Park's 66,000. Crucially, it had large, undeveloped tracts of land. Center's leaders, however, were wary of anti-Jewish feeling. They took steps to ensure that no community backlash could be mounted against the erection of a synagogue. On December 8th, 1946, David Gottlieb, who was a member of the center and owner of a national pinball manufacturing company, donated $25,000 to the center, dubbing it an investment in the future of Judaism in the western suburbs. With that money, the center purchased 2 parcels of land at the eastern border with Oak Park at the corner of Harlem and Thomas, where we stand today. The center completed the purchase on New Year's Eve 1946, and title passed to the center through a straw buyer. And so this is actually a bit tricky to see. I had to go to the basement of the Cook County building to get these records. But if you look on the bottom there, you see two records next to a record of Mr. Albert Hoffman. Mr. Albert Hoffman was a real estate developer and a member of the synagogue. The two records to his left are the two people who sold it to him, Anna Behrens and I think Jeanette Zlestra. They were two sisters. They'd inherited this land, which was bare, from their mother, who had passed away 5 years earlier. And so they sold it to Mr. Hoffman on December 30th, 1946. The very next day, the record below, and it's a bit hard to see, is a record of Mr. Hoffman transferring it to West Suburban Temple, or West Suburban Jewish Community Center, which was effected on December 31st, 1946. So the next day. The benefit of all this is that the Cook County Recorder of Deeds would have been closed for the holidays during this period of time. So the recording of the deed occurred simultaneously on January 3rd, which would, I think, have also been after any of the cooling off period requirements. So Ms. Zalestra and Ms. Behrens wouldn't have been able to back out of their transaction. So it's pretty, I think this is what happened. It's pretty smart if that's how they did it. However, with the selling of the land to the synagogue, another 3 years would pass before the synagogue would be built. And that's what the place where we're standing on looked like around the time of its construction, before anything was built. There appears to have been some benches. So it looks like a very nice field.
Is that time?
I think so.
Yeah.
I've been trying to figure it out myself. Harlem was not widened till four lanes until 1950. So I think it might be to the right there and we can't see it, but it would only been a 2-lane road. It's not wholly unsurprising when the plan for the new synagogue in River Forest encountered anti-Semitic resistance from the village. In October of 1947, 10 months after the center bought its land parcels there, the village of River Forest passed 2 ordinances. First was identical to the 400-foot frontage consent ordinance in Oak Park that had defeated the center's plans back in 1940. It's literally a copy-paste, same ordinance now passed in River Forest. The second ordinance required any new church or temple to provide 1 parking spot for every 10 seat in its sanctuary, which would have been a significant obstacle to constructing any house of worship, which at the time we were planning on intending this for 500 people. And if you look outside, you know we don't have 50 parking spots out there. Undeterred, however, by these new ordinances, the West Suburban Jewish Community Center continued to fundraise into 1948, and at the end of that year, hired the famed architects Lobel, Schlossman, and Bennett to design the large synagogue with space for expansion to a social hall. Rabbi Weisfeld had departed for a larger congregation in Dallas in December of 1944, where he would remain for many years. In October of 1945, the center welcomed a new rabbi, Monroe Levins, person on the left, who had come from the Twin Cities. While he was remembered years later as a very nice man, extremely gracious to the youth set, he was not the right fit, it seemed, for the congregation. During Rabbi Levin's tenure, however, the congregation formally affiliated with the American Conservative Movement, and in 1947, officially renamed itself the West Suburban Temple. In December of 1948, the temple hired a new rabbi, Rabbi Moshe Babin. Babin was 32 years old, fresh from his first placement as a rabbi in a Philadelphia synagogue, and he quickly jumped into the effort to build the new synagogue in River Forest. The temple leadership prepared to fight the village to get the synagogue built, but preferred to, quote, cooperate with the village authorities rather than attempt to force proceedings through action. To that end, Rabbi Babin embarked on a letter writing and a visiting campaign with local clergy within River Forest over the spring of 1949. The temple board also contained 2 capable attorneys, Sam Schmetter, who I mentioned, and Louis Shapiro, a law professor at DePaul University. By April 1949, Shapiro had met with the River Forest village attorney several times. In May of 1949, Shapiro appeared before the village board to express his views. This is how it appears in the minutes of the village board. Express his views regarding the ordinance, which was intended to prevent construction of the synagogue, per Shapiro. The village board pushed up that discussion for several months. 4 months later, the temple's leaders appeared again before the village board. This time, Mr. Shapiro was accompanied by the shul president, a co-chair of the building committee, and Rabbi Babin himself. Per the village board minutes, the group, quote, requested information concerning their desire previously expressed for the erection of a synagogue at Thomas and Harlem. In response, the village appointed a commission of 3 board members to hold a public hearing about those ordinances. They set a hearing date of October 3rd, 1949. That date just so happened to be Yom Kippur. Undeterred, Rabbi Babin appeared at this commission hearing, which would have coincided with the beginning of Ne'ilah services. After a long day of fasting and leading services, Babin walked from Northeast Oak Park to the village hall in River Forest, which would have been about 2 miles. The congregation was nearly 10 years into its search for a permanent home at this point. It had grown from 75 to now over 200 families, with more members joining every year. By this point, River Forest had 9 other churches. What harm was the addition of 1 synagogue? We don't have an account of Rabbi Babin's arguments or statements to the village board, but we can imagine them. The village board meetings, however, describe the report of the attorney for the village back to the board. The attorney indicated that the commission hearing, quote, failed to develop sufficient evidence to justify any opinion as to whether the ordinances were in the public interest or reasonable, and stated that the board should be guided by its legal advisor as to the legal aspect of the ordinances. Moments later, no doubt heeding the confidential advice of their attorney, the River Forest Village Board voted to repeal both of the discriminatory ordinances. The synagogue was now free of any legal impediment to its construction. The next month, the Village Building Commission approved the architect's plans and granted the permit for construction. In May of 1950, the synagogue laid its cornerstone for the new building, 15 years after the congregation had first come together in the darkest days of the Depression. The new West Suburban Temple officially opened its doors to much fanfare in the fall of 1951. Local suburban newspapers, as well as the Tribune, covered the affair prominently. The shul had hired a press agent. The synagogue took out a half-page ad in the local River Forest periodical, The Forest Leaves, and I think you see it here on the right. It also included the words, "Visitors welcome." A full-page article in that same issue offered tours of the new building to anybody who wanted to come and visit. The pride the community took in the erection of the synagogue can be found in a commemorative book it published for the occasion, which included well wishes from political dignitaries across the country, including from the office of President Truman, which was a letter solicited directly by Rabbi Babin. So you can see on the left, unfortunately, very small print, Rabbi Babin wrote directly to President Truman, and the press secretary for the White House submitted a letter back, which was published in this book. The building boasted a number of unique features. The bima was set on tracks, which were hidden under removable floorboards, and these I actually pulled from the Ryerson library inside the Art Institute has the papers of the Schlossman and Bennett, local Schlossman and Bennett firm, including our shul file of blueprints. And so these are the blueprints from 1949 for the synagogue. And so you can see the bima, and then on the right there is the sort of system of tracks which had to be pulled up. Charles knows these very well, because he's often required to do the pulling. The allowance of the removable floorboards allowed the sanctuary to accommodate nearly 600 people for high holidays. The architect also recommended a sculpture for the building's exterior, and the sculptor, Milton Horn, to provide it. Consulting with Rabbi Babin, Horn sculpted this 12 by 10 foot, 20-ton limestone relief of a multi-faced cherubim overcoming a behemoth, while holding up the 10 Commandments, symbolizing the laws of Moses. An inscription from the book of Zechariah, which was also selected by Rabbi Babin, was placed in block letters beneath it, "Not by might nor by power, so saith the Lord of hosts." A sculpture was placed on the external eastern wall of the synagogue, visible to drivers on busy Harlem Avenue, which, as I mentioned, was expanded from a 2 to a 4-lane highway earlier in 1950. Perhaps more relevantly, the stern cherubim stared down Oak Park to the east. The sculpture generated an enormous amount of press as the shul's leadership, and Horn himself noted that this was the first representational art incorporating human features on a synagogue since late antiquity. Sensational press accounts went out over the 8P wires, and Rabbi Babin actually received clippings about the synagogue's sculpture from as far away as Australia. In 1953, the Gottlieb Hall was completed. So this is Gottlieb Hall under construction. This is basically where we're standing now, kind of, where this guy is. I think you can do one more. In March of 1954, the synagogue held a dedication service. with 1,000 people in attendance, including 2 speakers. First term US Representative Sidney Yates, who's obviously later a very prominent member of Illinois politics and American politics generally, and the Vice Chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary, Dr. Max Arst. And picture in the center shows you in the middle a very young Sidney Yates, and on the right, Max Arst, and to the left is Rabbi Babin. By then, the synagogue was growing tremendously, numbering 320 families. I included in the slide some images of traditions that have stayed with us and with our shul since the earliest days. On the bottom left, from the late 1940s, you see Purim Carnival tickets being sold, and we just celebrated our normal Purim Carnival with those same kind of tickets. Top left is a Hanukkah celebration, a shul Hanukkah celebration, and in the back, behind the singer, is a very young Cantor Brindell. And Harold Brindell was, I believe, hired in 1953. In the right there, you see our religious school, and the little young guy smiling at you. Center is Len Grossman. For those of you who know Len Grossman, that's him, age 12, he says. The preschool opened in 1946, and as I mentioned, the religious school has been with us since the 20s in some form or another. And so with that, I leave you all, and this is kind of where I end my talk, and thank you for coming, and I'll take any questions you may have or anything you want to say to me one way or the other. Thank you for your time.
Made the board change its mind about its discriminatory ordinance?
So I have 2 theories I didn't include in here because they are speculative, but there was another member of the synagogue. So the village board notes are what I have in there, but what I have in the synagogue board minutes are a little different. The synagogue board minutes suggest that somewhere in the mid 1949 period, so 6 months before they changed their mind on this ordinance, a member of the synagogue named Jack Keeshan came to the board and said, "I'll do anything I can to help." Jack Keeshan, I didn't realize, the word I would use is macher. He was definitely like a big wheel. He owned a company called Freight Express, was the second or third largest trucking company in the United States of America. He lived actually right here in River Forest in what is now, there's a small apartment building there, but he had his own home of his own at the corner of Augusta and Bonnie Brae on the northeast side. So he was very close physically to where we are right now. He had built the Burma Road for Roosevelt. So he had secretly engaged in this project for Roosevelt. I have his biography, discusses it all, and he received an invitation to the FDR inauguration, and he's actually on the stage at Roosevelt's 3rd inaugural. He was obviously a very wealthy man from the trucking business. Later, he built Sportsman's Park. You guys are familiar with Sportsman's Park. He owned a football team in the late 1940s, and then he when his trucking company was bought out from under him and through a kind of board mechanism that happened in his company, he started a second company with Mr. Ratner, who I think his name appears in a lot of places in our synagogue. So I think, given his influence and power, he may have spoken to a number of village board members at River Forest and made some things happen. The other thing that happened is between 1947 and 1949, there was an election. So there was a different board, and some members were the older members and some were the newer members. And one of them was President Gabel, forget his name, he became the village board president of River Forest. And he, from what I found in a newspaper record, in 1948, there was riots in Cicero, race riots in Cicero. And one of the chief of police of Cicero said, push these rioters back, these white rioters back all the way to River Forest where they came from. Oh. And this new village board president was so incensed that he started a campaign against that chief of police in the newspapers and threatened to sue him. So I think, reading again between the lines, that maybe Mr. Gabel was concerned that he would look like a bigot and the village would have a bigoted reputation, and they didn't want that reputation. And it's possible that maybe Rabbi Babin and all these lawyers coming to him multiple times might have given the impression that maybe these Jews will sue him, and that would be bad, and the reputation of River Forest would suffer. But again, I'm interpreting based on like possibilities. I don't know for a fact.
I like to see more resistance in Oak Park than in River Forest.
That's tricky to say. they didn't really think to go to River Forest until after the war. And obviously, I will tell the story of Oak Park Temple, which has its own kind of narrative. It's a little easier for them, and partly, again, times changed. And I think it's fair to say that the war changed America in some way, and the war changed Jews, right? The Jews of 1940 were more scared, rightfully, of the attitudes of their Gentile neighbors, and there was much more overt discrimination. I mean, I don't think you would have seen in 1950 a letter from a community club directly in the village minutes saying, don't build a synagogue here. They would have been much more circumspect. So I do wonder if, like, they had tried in Oak Park in 1948, 49, if they had found a suitable location, if they might have been able to succeed. Ultimately, Oak Park Temple did succeed, right? So, and I tell that story next, but I do wonder if it was that they just coincidentally were coming into River Forest at a time where attitudes were changing across a number of locations.
Go ahead, Bob. Did you have a question?
Oh, well, I just wondered, in reference, in fact, to the letter that you just quoted. One doesn't expect that anything that was semi-public or actual public would contain references to, we don't want Jews here, or, you know, something like that.
That's
It
pretty
just
close.
says, no, we don't want this built. What was the rationalization given, if there was ever an opportunity to explain, well, why don't you want it?
I don't know if that opportunity ever came. I think that the closest that they came up with a law, a restrictive covenant, restrictive covenant is a different thing. They came up with this frontage consent, and now all of a sudden it's a neutral law on its face, although of course it wasn't. And it was targeted at a very specific time. And so while they can say neutrally, you didn't obtain the necessary 51% of the neighbors' votes. Well, I'm sorry, that's your problem. You guys have to get 51% of the neighbors to go along with it. I found historically that these frontage consents were actually already falling out of favor by 1940. There's actually a lot of literature about this. People would sue about them. And the reason people would sue is not because of religious, it's because industry was like, I'm building a factory in this neighborhood. It's going to happen. And so they would sue, saying the frontage consent was a restriction on their trade or so on and so forth. So, for example, in a similar period, maybe some of you remember there used to be a Barden dairy entity, the local dairy farm. Up until the 60s, there was one not far from here. Anyway, they used to build these dairy operations, and they would transport at certain points in time in the 20s via horse. No one wanted Barden dairy in their neighborhood because you had horse manure everywhere. And so there was a lot of complaints by people to create frontage consents to not permit those things to be built. And so this is like an iteration of that much later than you normally see. And I was actually surprised to see Oak Park adapt it, because other places had successfully been sued, and those ordinances were found to be either unconstitutional by state constitutional law or federal constitutional law. So
Times changed. Now we
Times
pay
changed.
extra for that manure.
that's right. Now it's a special thing. Yeah.
Maybe you'll touch on this when you discuss Reform Temple, Park Temple. Did we know anything more about Anna Behrens and Zesper woman?
I looked into them. No, they moved. They didn't want to live here anymore. They had families elsewhere. One of them lived in Indiana. One of them elsewhere. They inherited. Their mother was one of the first River Forest people. She like moved here. The Dutch immigrant moved here in the 1870s, 1880s, and so like had died at a very old age and left, you know, this land. And I guess they were just like, after the war, land was valuable. Let's sell it. So
were they were selling to Hoffman?
yeah.
Did they know who he was or any?
Hoffman was a real estate developer, along with a guy named Joe Willens, who was also a member of this congregation. I think later, actually, he joined OPT. And we see that he's buying at spec, he's building spec homes in or around this area. It wouldn't have been suspicious seeming that this guy Hoffman, who's literally in the business of doing this, is buying it. But then he immediately turns it around and sells it. I was trying to figure out if I could find any of Mr. Hoffman's descendants, and I haven't been successful to see if this story was in their family history or anything like that.
Questions?
Yeah, I was reminded many years later, not sure when, Oak Park Temple started housing some homeless people at night.
In the late 80s.
Yeah,
Right.
I can't remember.
It's in the file that somebody left at the
Yeah.
museum.
But at the time, this temple was asked if they would welcome these people, and they were told that the people would not. The river forest.
It was
would not.
complicated because it required a zoning or ordinance was, well, Sandra remembers this much more specifically than me. This is the predecessor to PADS, I think, right?
Yes, it was.
It was PADS.
It was pads. Oak Park had it, Rabbi Miralman, who was Rabbi Gerson during that time. So he tried, and they said no.
Who said
Forest
that?
said no.
Do you-
The village.
oh,
Village. However, then one of the churches, because this was the time when we finally became the, the council, community of congregations rather than the council of churches. So one of the do-gooder churches said they would do it, and that's when River Forest legally went to why they couldn't, and they just kind of gave up.
I think the reasoning was showers at the end of the day, that there wasn't enough sufficient showers for housing somebody, and because of that,
not only dark skinned, but
well, no one was gonna say that, but I mean, I definitely remember reading that was the final argument there.
I do want to say, and this goes to Bob's question, there are many places where Blacks and Jews, there are these covenants where we could not buy property,
I'm about to bring one up in the next presentation.
including in Oak Park.
Yeah,
But, I mean, it's
Restricted covenants.
it's restricted
Yeah.
covenants, and it's true. In today's time, and I was kind of interested where it was listed that you couldn't have a church, you couldn't have a synagogue, and you couldn't have a hospital. Well, guess what, folks? In today's time, folks are still trying to do that, and not permit our hospital, Rush Oak Park, to do due diligence to serve our community, and it's the neighbors, and they are influencing our elected people, and it just happened. More to come.
one last point about your real estate point. In May, I didn't bring it in this presentation because this presentation could have been 20 longer minutes. In May of 1941, the Oak Park Real Estate Board met with a walk-in item. Somebody came in as I brought it up, a woman named Dorothy Cusack. Dorothy Cusack was,
They had a big real estate.
that's right, Dorothy Cusack was the widow of Tom Cusack Senior, who had died in it. That's right, he died in a drowning accident, and so the son ended up ultimately inheriting the business. But from the late 30s, after the father had passed away and before the son had finished college and come back in the early 1950s, she ran the Cusack Realty. And she walked in with the item saying, she wanted to create a policy that Oak Park Real Estate would not sell to Jews or Italians in 1941. It's explicitly written this way. And so the real estate board members met, and it was decided that while they could not explicitly make that a rule, that it would be discouraged to sell to Jews or Italians. And explicitly, the way they came up with how they would do that is they would refer all the junior new real estate agents to this policy. So everybody got educated because there was new people coming in to be real estate agents. Maybe they don't know how we do things, and that they would stop advertising in Jewish newspapers. And indeed, I looked it up. There's two Jewish newspapers, the Reform Advocate and the Sentinel. There is not one real estate there's real estate ads for every other place. But in Oak Park and River Forest, the last one is from 1937 until the late 50s. So that happened. In addition,
The other group was Italian?
Italians, yeah, they're Italians coming from Cicero and other neighboring neighborhoods. And it's the whole Catholic infiltration problem, which was very problem in this.
Jewish Italians must have had a really.
No, Jews or Italians, yeah. This will
The
also,
Jewish Catholics that were the real.
I'll bring this up in the next presentation too, because it's a little bit more prevalent in the years actually after World War II, which is interesting to me, but should I get that one up and running?
Yeah, do you want to send
Sure.
that to me?
Let me
Or
try that
you
right now.
can plug your,
They could have built them together.
So given all your research, are you gonna write an article?
I wrote two articles.
Oh, you did?
The Chicago Jewish History Society publishes a quarterly magazine, and I wrote part 1 and part 2. So Oak Park part 1 starts in like 1916, ends in 1945. Oak Park River Forest Part 2 begins in 1945, ends in 1960-ish.
Now Michael's working on
And
Maywood.
now I'm working on Maywood, so if anybody,
Maywood people, have them contact Michael.
What was the name of the hardware store?
the Bright Hardware Store, right?
Is that the same as Bright Cleaners, the
Yeah.
same family?
Is it really?
I don't know, I'm asking,
Yeah.
yeah.
All right, Charles, I'm gonna send this to you. Does that work better?
That's fine, send it, yeah, to my work email. And then I'll. Get it going.
McCall also had the dry cleaners. Question where I saved this. Oh. Well, I hope it can fit.
Well, even if it's a drive link.
What kind of system do you have for connecting to this
Well,
graphically? Like I only have these.
I don't have,
HDMI?
I'll have to start Zoom on there. Can you?
No, that's not, I'm trying, it's just,
Oh.
I'm not on the network here.
Oh, sure, I'll give you the network. It's just you go on to,
I realize that was my
WSTAC
problem.
Guest, and it's the phone number. It's the password.
Is there a phone number again?
708-366-9000.
Okay, seems to be trying to send it to you. How many that goes? It's 21 megabytes, so it's a large file.
Yeah. Is it it's not the Pavel Har Zion cons? Oh, no, this is- okay. Let's see. Hasn't come through yet. Let's see. Give it a second. There we go. Got it. All right, I'm gonna download it. All right, it's downloading, and I've got it. Okay. We're good. Should be good to go here.
Does the screen go to sleep?
I think it did, yeah. I'll figure that out in a second here. Let's see.
I'm good, thank you. Does it open?
It says security warning references to external.
You can, it's
pictures.
fine, it's just using graphic images, some of different internet.
Oh, okay, all right, then I got it.
Washington.
You just didn't want it. There we go. Okay. Now, what's going on with the screen? There?
Oh, I see.
Do you just shake and reconnect it?
I don't know. Yeah, I'm not sure why it's,
Also, the TV goes to sleep, so.
yeah, but I don't think that it actually, it shouldn't. It shouldn't. But maybe it did. Nowhere else.
That's all right. There you go.
There it is.
All right. I'll do the same thing, Charles, and I just pointed you.
Okay, very
Unless I
good.
can get this to work all of a sudden. Oh, I can. It works now.
Oh,
Okay.
good.
All right.
Let me share. Sorry, I gotta do the screen sharing. Zoom, here we go. This one. Right, and go.
Well, Charles, now it's no longer on the screen. There you go. All right. All right, the history of Oak Park Temple. This is a sketch of the architects, Oak Park Temple.
B'nai Abraham Zion.
Correct. Oak Park Temple of Bnei Abraham Zion in the 1950s. I've called this the road to Oak Park. The history of Oak Park Temple of Bnei Abraham Zion began about 100 years ago, with its predecessor, the Washington Boulevard Temple. Time limits me from giving the exhaustive history of the predecessors to Washington Boulevard Temple, so I will just provide a brief sketch of the temple's history prior. Washington Boulevard Temple, located at between Madison and Washington and Karlov in the East Garfield Park neighborhood of Chicago, came from the merger of two congregations in 1918, Zion Temple and Temple of Bnei Abraham. Zion was founded in 1864, was the fourth oldest Jewish congregation in Chicago. It's a reform. Bnei Abraham was founded in 1868. It was the fifth. The Zion congregation was primarily drawn from German and Eastern European Jews who spoke German, and was an early American Reform temple, while Bnei Abraham's congregation was largely drawn from what were known as Bohemian Jews, or now we call them Czech Jews, but also who spoke German, and was originally Orthodox. But by the
Hold on just one second, this is not sharing the way it's supposed to be.
Which was the check?
Bnei Abraham was the Czech one. It's my understanding that they had a slight dominance in numbers over, this is according to the memories of Rabbi Schwartz in his biography. There was a slight domination by the Bnei Abraham Jews over the numbers who would come in from the Zion Temple.
Probably have best pills.
I'll just follow you
Okay.
as you change it.
By 1880s, however, that had become a Reform temple as well. In 1918, the combined congregation, now known as the Washington Boulevard Temple, hired a new rabbi to usher in the new merged shul, Rabbi Samuel Schwartz. Rabbi Schwartz was a recent emigre from Hungary who had trained at the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, the main Reform school, seminary in America and known internationally. He also met his wife Charlotte there, and from that place, he was recruited to become the new rabbi of the combined congregation, which had selected the name Washington Boulevard Temple. And if you look there, Bnei Abraham Zion's also still visible. The building pictured here was completed in 1921. Rabbi Schwartz quickly set to work designing the interior of the shul, including selecting the beautiful stained glass you see there. Now I can't advance it. Can you advance it?
I'm gonna stop the share and start it again. I don't know why it's not.
There we go. I just did that, I guess. This is the interior. You can see the stained glass is on the opposite side. You don't see it here. There's the massive organ, for which the records of the sale of the organ are still in the basement of Oak Park Temple. And the menorah, all of which were designed and planned by Rabbi Schwartz, actually, with the consultation of the architects and also the interior work of a number of contractors. He also set to work building up the religious school, which eventually reached 500 students. Can you advance one more?
One more?
Can you? Yeah. There we go. This is a vehicle that was used to transport kids from the religious school with the Washington Boulevard. I found this picture too funny because I can't imagine, it looks to me like a hearse, but this was how you would transport the kids from where they lived to the religious school. He hired an additional full-time instructor, Philip Sang, to assist in the religious program, introduced a weekly bulletin called the Temple Messenger for the membership, and generally was attending to his congregation. In 1939, Rabbi Schwartz was joined by Gunter Plaut, who became Dr. Gunter Plaut, who became the new associate rabbi. He was also, I believe, at that point, a recent graduate of the Hebrew Union College. He was himself a immigrant from Germany. By then, the congregation, which was in the middle of the Depression, had landed on hard times. Its most famous member and the former president of the Shoal was Adolf Sabat, a congressman from the West Side who would go on to be the longest serving member of Congress until John Dingell beat his 45-year record in 2013. Despite this prominent member, the congregation struggled to pay the mortgage on its building. It was also an aging congregation per Dr. Plout's memoirs, with its largest religious school confirmation class of about 64 graduates having been recorded in 1932. The number declined after that. A small minority of the Washington Boulevard Temple's membership lived in the western suburb. Prominently, both rabbis lived in Oak Park, Rabbi Schwartz having moved to Oak Park as early as 1923, and Dr. Plout moving in 1940. After the war, returning vets, including the children of Washington Boulevard Temple members, started to establish their lives further west than East Garfield Park. I reviewed the 1950 Temple membership address book, which did survive, and the center of gravity in that book seems to be somewhere in Austin. However, 67 of the 500 families that it counted as members were living in Oak Park and River Forest at the time. This was where the future lay. At the same time, there were changes happening within West Suburban Temple that would further cement Washington Boulevard Temple's move west. So in my previous talk, I spoke about Rabbi Babin. Rabbi Babin, who joined the temple in December of 1948, joined West Suburban Temple in December of 1948, accepted his pulpit with an understanding that he would need to exercise some religious discipline upon his congregation. Well, I think I spoke earlier, it was nominally associated with conservative style worship. The center also was a Jewish gathering place as much as it was a synagogue. And I think you saw from the previous presentation, photographs taken of dances suggest, into my mind, festive hootenannies. The center had multiple bowling trophies, underscoring a commitment to social activities, perhaps equal to religious service. In fact, in 1946, the membership guide for the West Suburban Community Center, Jewish Community Center, advertised a gun club marketed as, quote, something unique, something unusual that underscores sportsmanship among its members, and included a lox and bagel interlude during Sunday morning shoots. It survived only that 1 year. In the 1947 membership guide, there is no longer a gun club. Well, shortly upon his arrival in late 1948, Babin, writing to his more senior rabbinical counterpart at Anshe Emet, Congregation Anshe Emet in Lakeview, expressed that the synagogue needed some discipline and understanding that the rabbi was not a hired hand. Well, in 1949, Rabbi Babin convened a religious committee to standardize bar mitzvahs, which was now going to also include bar mitzvot, so for girls as well, which was a newer egalitarian practice, not by any means common at that time to conservative Judaism. The synagogue also tightened its standards of observance, and the bulletins at the time, I would say, bear an admonishing tone to encourage more regular synagogue attendance on Friday nights, as well as Saturday mornings. Before the cornerstone on West Suburban Temple was laid in 1950, Babin made clear the building was not to host social dances unrelated to religious celebrations. The new tone at the top led to a schism within the membership. In early 1949, a group of 30 prominent families left West Suburban Temple. The resigned members chartered an organization which they called Oak Park Temple. At that time, they approached Dr. Gunter Plout at Washington Boulevard Temple to see if they could establish what Plout described as a, quote, more liberal, though conservatively oriented community. I'm sure exactly what it means. Plout held long talks with them to persuade them to join Washington Boulevard Temple as a unit and then somehow preserve their identity. At the same time, in July of 1949, discussions were being held off the record, as it says in the notes of the record that I read, to see if there was some common ground to be found to merge the newly split Oak Park Temple group and the West Suburban Temple congregations. There was a committee even from West Suburban Temple, which was supposed to investigate this merger possibility in the schism, but they never really got it together. Instead, what happened is the Oak Park Temple splinter group and Washington Boulevard Temple. You can advance the slide one more, please.
Trying, sorry, let's see.
Maybe there's a delay.
I don't know. It's that one, right?
We'll go
the
with
next
this
one.
picture. It's gonna be the one after the car.
After the car,
Yes,
that, one. Okay. Oh, it's not,
it's not the car, it's the one after the car.
oh, it's the one in, I'm seeing it, but it's not,
It worked now.
all right.
Well, they signed a merger agreement, and as a first step to integrating the congregations, they opened branch classes of the Temple's Hebrew School at Oak Park's Oliver Wendell Holmes Public School in 1951.
Some of the folks here can't see the screen.
Well, Michael's trying to see it as well, so.
How would you like it to be? No, I know it
Can you see?
mostly by heart. For those of you who maybe know, there's Morris Siskin on the third from the top there. It's a young child. He was in the advertising material for this combined religious school. Anyway, they started with about 40 students. Eventually they moved to Man. Within the next year, in 1952, that class size had doubled in Oak Park from about 40 to about 75 students and reached over 302 by 1955. In June of 1952, encouraged by the expansion of the Hebrew school out here, Washington Boulevard Temple's membership voted to relocate their temple to a new building in Oak Park. To be determined. A significant temple fundraising was begun, and I enjoyed this because I found these in the bulletin. This is a good way to get people to give you money. This is the exquisite new Temple Emmanuel. How long do we have to wait for ours? And then my also favorite line of this is, we cannot spell synagogue without you, and then it puts the Y-O-U in capital letters, and then makes you see everybody who pledged, and if your name is not on there, it's a name or shame system, it's very effective. This was the work of, the president at the time was Edwin Sabbath, so the nephew of Adolph Sabbath, who owned a department store called Sabbath's, I think, yeah. And so he was the president during this time. He very strongly led this initiative along with the later president Elmer Benish.
And another Gottlieb.
And the Gottliebs were part of this initiative as well. There's actually an interesting amount, and the Gottliebs did not leave this synagogue. They were patrons of both synagogues financially, although I believe Alvin Gottlieb, who was David Gottlieb's son, spent, I think, more time at the other one, but it's unclear to me because I spoke with their grandson, and in his mind, they're part of both synagogues the whole time. That's right. Harry Hoffman was a president of OPT, but had started, he was one of the 30 families. And I'll get into it a little bit later. But significant temple fundraising was begun, an aggressive pitch to the members. This is an example of just one. With the example set by West Suburban Temple, the Western suburbs appeared nominally welcoming to Jewish families. Nevertheless, leaving nothing to chance, and having studied the exact example of West Suburban Temple, and now being advised by several members of that very same congregation who had joined the building committee of Oak Park Temple. Oak Park Temple acquired the land for the synagogue at Berkshire on Harlem through the help of a straw buyer in early 1954. And I haven't gone to the basement yet of the archives of the Cook County Clerk building, but I will find out exactly what transactions transpired. Ground was broken on the temple in April of 1955, and this is a picture from the groundbreaking. In his address delivered at the cornerstone laying 1 year later, the Shul president at that time, Elmer Benish, stated, this is what he said: obstacles had to be hurdled before ground could be broken. And he says, the legal talent of Shul members Harry Hoffman and Henry Berman were brought to bear, and both men presented their views to Russ Christensen, the president of the village of Oak Park. That's all I have for a source on what happened. It seems, however, that by the point that happened in 1955, the village was not a hindrance to the synagogue's construction. And based on the statements and speeches given at the cornerstone laying, perhaps cleared the way to its easy construction. But that there could still be anti-Semitic sentiment in Oak Park as late as 1955 is sadly not surprising. So here we have a design picture of the sketch, just called New Temple, by the way. They hadn't decided on a name yet. Is it going to advance one more?
Sure.
More sketches?
Yeah.
One more, yeah. Here's the initial post groundbreaking. That's Rabbi Schwartz in the middle there holding the American flag, the older gentleman, along with, I think, the president of the Shul. That might be Elmer Benish.
It looks kind of like Harry Truman, doesn't it?
A little bit, yeah. He would have been about 75 years old at this point. All right, you can advance one more. Is more construction photos. and as the religious school kids get to visit in late 1955. Is it like finicky?
I don't know.
All right, just stop here. The cards on the left are real estate card listings, as they used to exist in Oak Park and River Forest between the 1920s and actually as late as the 1980s. This is basically the first version of what we know as the MLS or multi-listing system that we have today. And if everyone's ever been on Redfin and benefited from searching through real estate where all the listings are provided at once, it's definitely not always accurate. But the system used to exist in this form, and Oak Park actually was kind of innovative apparently in this space. All the members of the Oak Park real estate boards would receive listings like this, and the cards would have to be reproduced. So every member of every agency would get the cards from the seller agent, and they would be deposited in a card catalog like system. One set of those card catalogs is at the Oak Park River Forest Museum, combining the work of the Cusack Realty and one other realty firm, I'm forgetting its name right now. Walter James, is that who I'm thinking of? Those two records have been combined and placed in the, a card catalog exists of basically. That's right.
Told us not to buy our house at Taylor and Washington. We should buy near Mann School because that's where people like us live.
Sure. Male and female.
So here you have two cards that it took me a while to find these, by the way. I just started flipping through them. I'm like, I wonder if they actually said, you know, who they couldn't sell to. And it didn't take me that long. These are from 1945 and 1950. This one at the bottom says remarks, no Jews or Italians, copper gutters. So now you know all about this house. So this is 1133 Columbian Avenue, right? But pretty good, $25,000 in 1945. It had been on the market since 1940, and so the sat empty during the war. The seller here is actually interesting. This is Elwood Ratcliffe. Elwood Ratcliffe is the son-in-law of George Gunderson. So if you're familiar with the Gunderson homes in South Oak Park, this is his nephew. George Gunderson had just died in 1940. So my thinking is this actually might have been once his home, and then they inherited it, and then they sold it. Anyway, no Jews. No Italians either. And by the way, George Gunderson, I found an oral history of Elwood Ratcliffe and his wife, who was George Gunderson's daughter. And she remembers when Gunderson was selling his homes in the turn of the century up until like the late teens, early 20s, that there was a policy he had. He wanted to make sure everybody who bought his house was a regular churchgoer. So I will let you interpret that how you will. This one is from 1950, 538 Belfort. Remarks, no Jewish people. So I'm sure. I am absolutely sure. On the right here is a new sub. So you got these two kind of cards. It gives you a sense of some existing anti-Semitism in home real estate sales. On the right is an ad for River Forest's newest restricted development, River Oaks. River Oaks, you might have encountered when you've driven west on Lake Street. It intersects with what looks to be it's actually a Frank Lloyd Wright designed cul-de-sac arch on Auvergne Street. This listing identifies it as restricted. It was in fact shown only after a phone appointment and was per records restricted to Jews. It was also subject to a racial restrictive covenant, and one of the owners of one of these homes, there's about 17 ranch homes in this property. One of them was looking at the deed of her home and noticed this restrictive covenant in an older record that had inherited, and she brought it to the museum. And so the museum gave me a copy of the racial restrictive covenant that existed. About a year and a half ago, the River Forest Historic Commission was looking at designating this cul-de-sac as a historic thing. And they again rediscovered that it was restricted, and they decided apparently not to. But the researcher also brought to the attention of the museum that it was restricted to Jews and to the Black community as well.
And eventually Cantor Lindell lived in that community.
Is that right? And my understanding, I talked to several Jewish people who lived there and Black people who lived there, and a gay couple lived there up until very recently. So it's not, maintained this status, but just to give a sense of what things were like in this period of time between 1945 and 1955. If you can advance the track one more here. In 1954, the Anti-Defamation League investigated a listing in the Chicago Tribune for a new townhome rental in Northwest Oak Park at the address of 1011 Harlem Avenue. So it's literally across the street. It's one of those relatively newish looking from the 1950s buildings, which had advertised itself as restricted, meaning restricted against Jews. The ADL actually conducted an investigation, which was part of its division of its discrimination division. So in the basement, in the Suburbs Institute, the ADL in Chicago actually deposited its research and report records, which included investigations it did against job and employment discrimination organized by suburb, which is actually very interesting. So in Oak Park, this is the only record that they had. They had many in other suburbs. But if anyone knows anybody who wants to write a PhD, those have been untouched, apparently. You can really, it's really an investigative file. This is what it looks like. You open up a folder, and in it is like the steps the person took to investigate step by step. Here is sort of the final resolution. There's letters inside that show the correspondence of what they did. There's reports on how they identified the people who were responsible, what the interview was like. Was the person aggressive? Was the person willing to do it? What their assessment is? Do we need to be litigating down the road? So it's a very interesting view of the ADL of that time. But here's what happened in this case. The ADL representatives started to investigate. They consulted actually with Rabbi Babin because they're like, this is across the street from the only synagogue in town. They went in, asked him whether he would be willing to help their efforts to change the practice of the realtor listing this particular townhome. Babin offered full cooperation, and he admitted he had heard rumors that Jews sometimes struggle to find apartments and homes in Oak Park and River Forest. The ADL representative then posed as a prospective renter for the townhomes, and after an hour with the realtor, finally disclosed that he himself was Jewish. At that point, he was told the premises were restricted and they were not interested in selling to Jews. And then the realtor even goes further and identifies another townhome complex 2 blocks north that was also restricted. And that actually was a building 1 block from Oak Park Temple, so just north on Harlem Avenue, which the synagogue was actually, Oak Park Temple was physically under construction at that time in 1955. The ADL representative then followed the organization protocol, and his job was to do the following things. He paid a visit to the building's owner, its mortgage bank, and after many unanswered phone calls and letters, the realty company itself. And after each of these visits, it took about a year to complete them all. The realty company agreed not to list any more restricted properties. They terminated the offending realtor, and they averred that no similar anti-Semitic discrimination would be permitted in the future. So it's a very interesting, you have a record of the conversation he had with the bank, and the bank's like, oh my God, I would never lend to somebody who would discriminate like that. And so you get a lot of these I would never conversations written down and recorded by the ADL representative. And so imagine that times about 1,000, and you have a sense of what is going on at the Suburbs Institute. In June of 1956, the newly renamed Oak Park Temple laid the cornerstone on its building at the intersection at the northwest corner of Oak Park, 2 blocks north of West Suburban Temple, which and in that same year renamed itself West Suburban Temple Har Zion. And I wonder if it's because there was fear that there'd be confusion in the names. They don't say that, but that's my theory. Oak Park Temple boasted 450 members. The building housed a large social hall, or was going to host a large social hall, have classrooms and a sanctuary, again with a moving wall to accommodate larger high holiday crowds. And you can advance a couple of photos here and just see, this is the, I found these great colored photos. There's about 30 or 40 of them, but that's Rabbi Schwartz. As you can see, they did not yet have a finished building. And you can see the scaffolding in the background here. And over here, you can see this is definitely not a proper dais. This is some makeshift wooden dais that was built. They would actually finish moving in the fall of 1956. But in June, on a nice summer day, they had this. This entire presentation was recorded on a realtor reel, and that realtor reel was inserted in the cornerstone, which is in the previous picture. And in 2014, at their sesquicentenary, it was uncovered and digitized, and the recording is incredible. It's actually probably I shared, Rabbi Babin spoke at this, and I spoke with his daughter last weekend, and she was unaware that his voice had been recorded. So I was able to send her that speech. And there's a lot of good speeches from the village manager of Oak Park came to this, as did Rabbi Schwartz, member of the Reform Movement National, and I think but I'm forgetting if some representative from Congress spoke at this one too, but I get confused with other times. You can advance it one more, Charles. And that's the insertion in the cornerstone of a number of archival records of B'nai Abraham Zion records, Washington Boulevard records, and the reel-to-reel of the very ceremony they had just finished recording went directly inside that thing. We can go one more. As the 1950s progressed, the two congregations stayed on very friendly terms and regularly partnered for community events. Rabbi Babin and his counterpart at Oak Park Temple, Rabbi Leonard Mervis, introduced a speaker series that they dubbed the Forum. So here's the presentation of the very first Forum series. During the 1950s, the Forum would host such luminaries as Senator Hubert Humphrey, actor Vincent Price, and former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. And here she's pictured with Rabbi Babin. Rabbi Babin's daughter shared with me that after this day, Eleanor Roosevelt came to the rabbi's house for dinner, which was a crazy experience. So they all have photos of him. She was maybe 7 years old at the time. So her and her two sisters are pictured with Eleanor Roosevelt in their living room. And whenever she shows these photos to young people, they say, "Was that your grandmother?" So 3 months after the conclusion of the 1956 Suez War, the president of Oak Park Temple, Harry Hoffman, who was himself a major contributor to Israel bonds, announced the two congregations would host Abba Eben, Israel's ambassador to the US and to the UN. And I don't have pictures of that. If anyone does, that would be incredible, because that was a sold out crowd here. About 1,000 people came, and he gave a major address that was covered in national newspapers. To commemorate the occasion, though, Oak Park Village President Russ Christensen proclaimed the day of Eben's speech to be Israel Day in the village of Oak Park, and a proclamation to that effect was given to the both congregations' presidents. Let's see here. Can you advance one more, Charles? By the late 1950s, anti-Semitic attitudes had softened somewhat, and the Jewish population in the village increased. You can see from this real estate listing card, which is from March of 1956, the synagogue is actually advertised. 3 blocks to synagogue, spelled incorrectly. Also next to the playground, 2 blocks to Man, 5 to St. Giles. So there's a feature, not a bug, of the synagogue's existence, a selling point to prospective buyers. And you can advance one more here. I just want to close my talk on a couple of events in 1964. That year, Oak Park Temple celebrated its centenary. It was the 100 years after its founding at Zion Temple in 1864. The event was marked by a gala, which took place at the Continental Plaza Hotel. The show committee solicited and received a letter from Lyndon Johnson, which is identified here on the left. The speakers at the gala, though, also reflect the importance of that day for the shul's leadership. Senators Paul Douglas and Abe Ribicoff spoke, Mayor Richard J. Daley spoke, and Rabbi Schwartz spoke, who in 1964 was 84 years old. He would live until 1976, when he was 95 years old, and he was identified as the oldest living Reform rabbi at that time. Can you advance one more? That same year, Illinois was also facing a different challenge: the civil rights movement and the issue of open housing, the right to live where you wanted, free of discrimination on the basis of race or religion. In 1964, an initiative to oppose open housing by statewide referendum was promoted by the Illinois Real Estate Board. Much like the Oak Park Real Estate Board, all the real estate boards at that time were wary of open housing. The Oak Park Board of Realtors, which was the new name of the Oak Park Real Estate Board, purchased a series of ads in the local newspaper in support of that referendum and against open occupancy, as it was called. And they focused on the constitutional right to sell your property to whoever you wanted to, including with racial restrictions. Petitions were drawn up for local residents to sign in support of the referendum opposing open housing. Oak Park Temple had a social action committee, and that committee formed a subcommittee on open occupancy. And they wrote this letter, which was sent to all members of the congregation, urging their members to reject the petition. And they draw specifically upon the experiences of the Jewish community with housing discrimination. And for those who can't read it, in the middle paragraph, they say, Jews themselves have not been and are not now free from restraint in choosing a residence. We should be able to approach this issue with understanding and compassion because we too are slaves in Egypt. So I thought that was very poignant. And this was sent to every member of the congregation. Ultimately, Illinois General Assembly considered legislation which was supported by then Governor Otto Kerner, who himself was a River Forest native, to encourage what would soon be called fair housing. This referendum by the real estate boards was actually killed by Kerner and the election commission that he controlled. The issue, however, would return again in 1968 in Oak Park with a dramatic vote, which I'm sure we all have heard of, at the village trustee board, and the passage of our first of its kind open housing ordinance. So I just wanted to highlight sort of as a sort of tail end of the story that, you know, all these aspects really informed, I think, the way that the Social Action Committee of both synagogues treated and thought of these issues. And so I thought this was a good place to stop because many of you lived through many of the histories of a lot of these places in later years, and I didn't want to, you know, impinge upon anyone's specific memories. But that's where my talk ends on Oak Park Temple. So if anyone has any questions on that, I can answer, but only to the best of my ability. I didn't spend as much time on that congregation's history.
Thank you.
Question about, you mentioned Hubert Humphrey came down here, was that in the mid-50s?
57. Yeah, we have a picture of, so the thing we've preserved in our basement of this synagogue is all the headshots that the agents sent. So I have a headshot of Hubert Humphrey, a headshot of Vincent Price, a headshot of Mo Tucker.
Why did he come here? I mean, he was, I believe, at least in the early 50s, he was the mayor of Minneapolis.
He was mayor of Minneapolis until 1948, and then he was a senator from 1948 until he became vice president. He was a in-demand speaker. I mean, he was a big deal senator, but I'm guessing also he had a very good press agent and was able to be, I mean, why is Eleanor Roosevelt coming? I think that they had speaking tours, and I'm guessing that we paid some amount of money for them to come here. The contracts do exist somewhere. They're in the board minutes about like the contracts they made with the various speakers, but it was an initiative, I think, that was driven by Rabbi Babin, and then Oak Park Temple joined that initiative because the cost sharing was needed.
One unrelated question, the temple, I think on Washington Boulevard, they showed a picture of the Bema, and it looked, I don't know anything about architecture, but it looked like I've seen the Parthenon, very Greek.
Mhm.
There's also a picture of the door behind the car that drove the kids around,
Mhm.
very Greek shape.
Yeah,
That building was originally built and designed by the Jews, right?
yeah, no, it
So
was,
why did they have such a Grecian?
when
There's
Rabbi
no more
Schwartz,
influence.
that's a good question, actually. When Rabbi Schwartz, well, that whole triangle look, I mean, if I'm not mistaken, Anshe, KM has a kind of similar, but almost like a Byzantine looking structure down in Hyde Park. And I think it was built about 10 years before that in like 1911.
This is very typical of
Yeah.
ecclesiastical architecture in various religions, including Judaism, to look back and try and not completely identify, but to make associations with the past that might draw up associations with the past of our religious foundings and stuff. And it's just very common, and it was sort of an anti-contemporary thing. That's too strong. It was just a way of adding some gravitas. Very common.
I could-
All of that.
Yeah, if any of you have visited the shul in Florence, Italy, it looks very busy too. I think it goes to the 19th century, so. And the sun is quite bright. Well, of course, for a long time, it was, these buildings were simply built in the normal style of the time. That after a certain point, they reversed back to the previous styles because of this accentuation.
And this temple was designed with the premise of it kind of fitting into the Frank Lloyd Wright style, prairie style. So it was intended specifically to blend.
I was just gonna add that in the books, in the synagogues of Ralph Packer's book about the synagogues, they're all that, I mean, the majority of the old synagogues looked at that classic very different from today's synagogues.
Yeah, and that building is gone.
And look at today's pictures and he's totally.
I was looking at their sale records. They sold it to a gas station company. And then I assume tore it down and built a gas station. And then now it's an empty lot, which is sad.
And it's looking at Oak Park Temple, what is it? It's essentially a ranch house.
It is. It does look like a big ranch house.
Split level ranch, you can find them all over, you know, Highland Park and all kinds of suburbs. Bought like this, then with it, and like that.
It's also an odd, both tracts of land are actually just oddly long. So none of us can have the temples face east properly for that reason, right? Because they're like longer and not square. So that's another thing. It's like, what are you gonna do when you have just this like north-south situation? And also, you don't want it to face, you don't want to pray at Harlem Avenue necessarily. Maybe you could.
But then you get all the nice east light through those windows.
That's true.
Can't beat that.
That's true.
By the
I
way,
just- Where the Hebrew school car is.
I was
I
curious
love
about
that
that
thing.
myself. I mean, I assume they sold it to a cemetery.
Oh, that big Hebrew school car from the Washington Boulevard synagogue.
Yeah, maybe, but I have never said that.
Any other question about Oak Park Temple, West Suburban Temple, excuse me, Har Zion and B'nai Abraham Zion?
And,
Hughes, on Oak Park in the thirties, did I do that right?
Yeah, that's that's right. That's from like one of the guides. They used to have the,
The writer's guide to Illinois.
no, there was a Jewish, like they try to sum up how many congregations were in different areas. I forget what that guidebook was called, but it was put together in the 20s and continued every few years.
And that was about a population of around 60,000.
Ish, yeah, that's the
You know, Park,
census.
73,000.
That was the peak.
Thirties, which was the highest population it's ever had.
Yeah.
60.
Did they list the communities with 0 Jews in that list?
No, they point out this one and they point out Maywood. And then you can go to Joliet and there was something in Joliet too.
Just because I don't know, I think the synagogue here is now referred to as Har Zion.
Mhm.
And I just, how was that decision? I mean, was that because I've been calling it West, it's the.
West Suburban Temple, I think we still call it WSTHZ.
I just
So,
know what you call that.
what-
I'm
so
just
we-
Curious how that worked out.
Just before I started,
Yeah.
probably around the time when Rabbi Glick started his tenure, his rabbinate, they kind of decided that the location the board really didn't matter, and it was almost a discouragement because of limiting it geographically. So we still are West Suburban Temple Har Zion in terms of our state, charter, but we call ourselves Temple Har Zion.
But you said that started when Oak Park Temple.
They added Har Zion in 1957, and there's and the Sentinel describes why, and it was so that they could have something that was more religious sound. There's some reasoning there, but I actually do wonder, coincidentally, it's exactly the same time where Oak Park Temple shows up, and they just are like, let's add this thing that makes it so that our name is slightly more distinct from Oak Park Temple, because I could see a person getting very easily confused.
This is tangential, but what is the Jewish population of Oak Park today?
That's actually a really good question. Do we know?
I have no idea.
There-
I've heard as much as 5%.
Certainly, they go by, where you're affiliated. And many people are not affiliated, so you don't know. However, X years ago, before I worked for the village and before I was the village clerk for sure, the head of our community relations department wrote a whole big thing about the demographics of the community. And every different ethnic group, just whatever, the list except for us big Jewish people, we're not all Jewish here. And I called on him and I said, I think you're missing something. What? Well, he just passed away recently, so may rest in peace. Oh, I'm so sorry. But were non-existent. And right now, and I'm sorry that it was gone. We have a lot of issues in our community with anti-Semitism. In the community and in the school. And it is heartbreaking, I will say. And the west side of Chicago, we're not from here, so we never experienced it. But when Austin started changing, and we did our fair housing ordinance, we got in to vote for. People really tried to work together and open, inclusive, more inclusive, and now we're getting into separating out, and it's very disturbing. So our son went to the University of Wisconsin at Madison. We belonged to Oak Park Temple, Har Zion the whole time. We're not super Jews, he's not a super Jew, but we're Jewish. He belonged to a Jewish fraternity. Okay? And all of the kids came from the North Shore, or from New York, or from Minnesota, or Wisconsin. And so one of his friends came to visit us at our house, where we were told not to buy our house. And he said, oh, you know, my grandparents grew up in Chicago, and he actually expected our house and our community to be slum. That was his thought, because the parents had to move away and they thought Oak Park was just gonna be terrible. And it was like shocking. We lived in a very nice house. I thought it was a mansion. Trust me, it was not a mansion. Sorry, Dean.
I didn't build it, I just bought it.
But to me, I lived in a mansion. I never lived in a house. I mean, my parents and how I was brought up in the South Bronx, no way. But we're a minority. We are the biggest minority. So whatever numbers there are, and to fight X years ago for West Suburban Temple, Oak Park Temple, Leonard Grossman, my husband, and good church people to develop a community of congregations when we were not permitted to belong to the community, the council of churches. Rabbi Mervis, may he rest in peace, tried, and he was told, we'll give you the minutes. And that was it, the minutes. And we weren't the only Unitarians couldn't belong, the Baha'i people couldn't belong, etc. And I love the song man who spoke. But if you really want to see a history of anti-Semitism in the community, and I could do it from when we moved here. And people will say, oh, but you were an elected official, your husband was an elected official. Well, yeah, we were, but I mean, we could tell you, and right now at the high school, it's really scary, people.
I think Gary Gerson got the name changed.
And Gary didn't, he was part of the group.
We went to
There was a committee.
and I was on the committee with the ministers.
And Leonard.
We worked on that committee about changing the name and stuff. And Rabbi, and one of the ministers said, well, we're here to take Jesus out of the bylaws.
The reason I asked is that during your presentation, you seem to know what the population. is,
Yeah, I'll tell you
even
why.
Before there were.
It's actually interesting.
synagogue.
Oak Park had a religious census that it conducted every 5 years from 1946 to 1961. So we have 46, 51, 56, and 61's religious percentages. They peak in the Jewish numbers in somewhere between like the 56 and 61 at about 2.5% to 3%. But that is the last time they were taken. Now, I was told by Len, who grew up here starting in 1952. He told me, and his father, was an alderman in the city, and he was like an older man, so he actually had known all about the Chicago Jewish West Side for 50 years before that. And so he told me that his father had told him the move was Jews were moving west, always, until a certain point where they weren't. And so you had a community, Maxwell Street, at the turn of the century, and they moved west by the teens and 20s to what is known as the Greater Lawndale District. So North Lawndale, East Garfield Park is like the periphery of it, and going west to Austin to some extent. Eventually, Austin ends up having 3 synagogues, and then the thought was further west, Oak Park, River Forest, and Maywood. Maywood had a Jewish community that probably was closer to almost 10% of that town at its peak, which was somewhere in the like late 40s, early 50s. And I'm still like learning the demographic numbers exactly, but that's what I've been told by a number of people. But then what happened is per Len, well, then all the Catholics started moving west. And so he said they outnumbered us like 100 to 1. So he said the Italians and the Irish. Right. Well, then there was white flight that was definitely a huge part of it, right? But there was an Italian and an Irish move west that started immediately after World War II. And there's only so many houses here, right? They're not going to build new houses in Oak Park. They stopped doing that really at a certain point in time. And in River Forest, similar. And so you end up with like only a limited amount of housing stock to buy. So that's the story he told me. He says, well, that sort of stalled it out. And then at a certain point, the highways moved north and people moved north. So
One of their Orthodox.
I was gonna say, there's an ultra Orthodox group here, and then there's some other group that I remember going to farmer's market.
the secular, yes.
Right.
So the Chabad, I think you're talking about the Chabad. The Chabad started in like 06. I think I looked this up. They started here in 06, and then the secular started in like 02, 03.
What are their numbers?
That's a good question. Chabad,
But then as you get to a certain age, those kids go to private schools and
they moved to other places. It's true. And I don't think the Chabad presence is particularly large.
Yeah, and the
Nobody
Chabad
said
presence in Oak Park is not like the Chabad presence is in smaller communities and far flung. It reflects the demographics of Oak Park. So you don't have families with 10 and 12 children, in Oak Park and River Forest.
I'll say if we had a large Chabad community in Oak Park, we would know we had a large
Yeah.
Chabad community.
It's hard to know, so how many of you received your Purim gift?
You mean from
Sure enough.
Chabad?
How many of us received our Purim gift from the Chabad?
Are you talking about the booklet?
No, I'm, every year,
I always get the book.
if they know you're Jewish, you will get a gift. We got our gift, we always get our.
What was it? What was it?
I got nothing.
It had hamantashen, it had different kinds of,
News to
It
me.
was a religious school.
and other.
They left me alone.
Delivered by Rabbi Bernstein.
It's delivered, and
There's a gap.
one of my dear friends who is not Jewish